Somewhere in Chipping Norton in the summer of 2019, a man stood at the edge of a field and watched his entire oilseed rape crop get eaten alive, not damaged, not struggling, eaten by flea beetles, millions of them. Moving through the crop like a slow-motion fire, he couldn't stop it. He had no weapon. The only pesticide that worked, the only chemical ever proven to reliably control cabbage stem flea beetle at the scale of a working British farm, had been made illegal 6 years earlier. And the decision that made it illegal was not made in Westminster. It was not made by a British court. It was not made by a British regulator. It was made in Brussels in 2013 by a committee most people in this country have never heard of, responding to a scientific assessment that has since been contested, revised, and complicated beyond almost all recognition. That moment, the 140 million people watched on Amazon Prime and assumed was down to a television presenter not knowing what he was doing, was not incompetence. It was not bad luck. It was the direct, traceable, documented consequence of a specific regulatory decision made half a decade before Jeremy Clarkson ever bought a single acre of diddly squat farm. And here is the part that makes it worse. Brexit didn't fix it. The UK government kept the ban. And the farmers, who had no voice in the original decision, found themselves with no voice in the one that followed either. If you've never heard that story told that way, you're about to. If you're new here, we cover the real business and policy stories behind British farming, the ones most channels never go near. Subscribe now and hit the bell. We publish every week, and this is exactly the kind of story we exist to tell. Start with what was actually visible on screen. Season 1 of Clarkson's Farm, Episode 2. Jeremy Clarkson standing in a field of oilseed rape that looks, in his own words, absolutely terrible. Yellow patches, thin, struggling stems. Leaves riddled with tiny holes as though someone had taken a hole punch to every plant in the ground. Kaleb Cooper, his farm manager, who was already working at Diddley Squat when Clarkson bought the land, identified the problem immediately. Cabbage stem flea beetle, a tiny black insect roughly the size of a sesame seed that had quietly become one of the most destructive agricultural pests in England. Clarkson looked at the field. Kaleb explained what had happened. And 40 million viewers watched and formed the same conclusion. Celebrity farmer, no idea what he's doing. Classic. That conclusion was wrong, and understanding exactly why it was wrong requires going back not to 2019 and not to Diddley Squat, but to a regulatory process that started in Europe in 2012 and ended with a decision that rewrote the economics of British arable farming permanently. Here is the science, briefly, because it matters. Neonicotinoids are a class of insecticide. Systemic chemicals, applied as a coating on seeds before they go into the ground. As the plant grows, the chemical moves through its tissue, stems, leaves, the whole structure, and acts as a deterrent to insects that try to feed on it. For cabbage stem flea beetles specifically, neonicotinoid seed treatments were not simply effective. They were in a different category from everything else available. Farmers treated their seeds before planting. The chemical protected the crop through the most vulnerable period, early emergence, when the flea beetles are most active and the plants are most fragile. The timing was perfect, the protection was consistent, and the application was contained. The chemical stayed in the seed and the plant, not broadcast across the whole field. The specific neonicotinoids used on oilseed rape in Britain were called thiamethoxam and clothionidin. In 2012, the European Food Safety Authority began a risk assessment. In 2013, they concluded that these chemicals posed an unacceptable risk to bees. In 2013, the European Commission imposed a ban on their use on flowering crops, including oilseed rape. And in 2013, every oilseed rape farmer in England lost the only tool that reliably worked. Now, here is where this story stops being about Clarkson and starts being about something that should have been front page news for 3 years and wasn't. The ban was designed to protect pollinators, bees specifically. The concern was that neonicotinoids were contaminating pollen and nectar, and that bees foraging on treated crops were being harmed, with consequences for colony health and population numbers. That concern was real. It was scientifically grounded. Nobody in this story is arguing that bee populations don't matter or that pesticide risk assessment is meaningless. But here is what happened when the ban came into force. Farmers still had a flea beetle problem. The beetles didn't disappear. They didn't adapt. They arrived every August and September, the same as always, in the same numbers, with the same appetite. The ban removed the solution. It did not remove the problem. So farmers turned to the only alternatives available: pyrethroid-based foliar sprays, chemicals applied not to the seed before planting, but broadcast across the growing crop, sometimes 2, 3, 4 times in a single season, depending on pressure. And here is the counterintuitive truth that almost nobody reported. Pyrethroids are broad-spectrum insecticides. They do not discriminate. They kill flea beetles. They also kill ground beetles, hoverflies, parasitic wasps, and, in significant quantities, bees. The ban introduced to protect bees caused British oilseed rape farmers to adopt a chemical regime that killed a broader range of insects, more frequently, across more surface area than the targeted seed treatment it replaced. The cure made it worse, not slightly worse, measurably, documentably worse. And then the crop area collapsed. In 2012, the last full season before the ban came into force, England had approximately 756,000 hectares of oilseed rape in the ground. By 2020, that figure had fallen to under 390,000 hectares. Half the crop gone, not because demand for rapeseed oil fell, not because farmers suddenly decided they didn't want to grow it, because without effective flea beetle control at the seed stage, the establishment risk was too high. You could spray pyrethroids and hope for a dry August and low beetle pressure and perfect timing, and still lose 30, 40, 60% of your crop to larvae in the stem and adult feeding on the leaf. Or you could grow something else. Most farmers grew something else. The ones who didn't, the ones who kept planting oilseed rape because of their rotations, their soil, their contracts, their equipment, took the risk every year with inadequate tools. Jeremy Clarkson was one of those farmers. He planted oilseed rape at Diddley Squat in 2019, 6 years after the ban, with exactly the same inadequate chemical toolkit that every other oilseed rape farmer in England had been forced to use since 2013. The flea beetles arrived. The pyrethroids didn't work well enough. The crop was decimated. And 40 million people watched it happen live and called it a learning curve. It was not a learning curve. It was a policy consequence with a name and a date and a document trail. That is not bad luck. That is a law. Here is the detail that almost every other video about his story has completely missed. The 2013 ban was not the end of the regulatory story. It was the beginning of an argument that has continued in various forms for over a decade, and that argument has produced some of the most uncomfortable moments in British agricultural policy in recent memory. In 2021, the year Clarkson's farm first aired on Amazon Prime, the UK government, Post-Brexit, now operating its own regulatory framework through the Health and Safety Executive, granted an emergency authorization for the use of thiamethoxam-treated oilseed rape seeds, a time-limited, geographically restricted emergency exemption. Farmers in certain areas could use the banned chemical for 1 season. The environmental lobby was furious. The National Farmers Union said it was necessary. The government said it was temporary. The same authorization was granted again in 2022 and again in 2023. The pest pressure is real. The alternatives are insufficient. The crop area will continue to collapse, and each time the authorization was granted, a second argument was quietly confirmed that the 2013 ban, as applied to oilseed rape in Northern Europe's climate and pest conditions, may have been based on risk modeling that did not adequately account for the specific conditions of British arable farming. That is not a fringe view. That is a position that has been put in writing by the UK government's own advisory bodies. It did not get the coverage it deserved. And Jeremy Clarkson's beetle-eaten field in Season 1, which is arguably the most watched agricultural policy consequence in British broadcasting history, was never connected to it publicly until now. If you're still here, and the fact that you are tells you something, do hit subscribe. What comes next is the part of this story that explains why the people who designed the ban didn't see this coming, and why the scientists who disputed it couldn't get anyone to listen. Don't miss it. Go back to Kaleb Cooper for a moment. Kaleb Cooper, who grew up in Chipping Norton, who has been farming since he was a teenager, who took on the management of Diddley Squat as a working farm operation and found himself suddenly as the unlikely co-star of a television series watched in 190 countries. Kaleb knew about the flea beetle problem before Clarkson arrived. Every farmer in Oxfordshire knew about it. It was not new, it was not surprising, and it was not specific to diddly squat. It was the condition of English oilseed rape farming after 2013. You planted, you sprayed, you hoped, you lost a percentage. You called it the cost of doing business in a post-neonicotinoid environment. What Kaleb could not have known, what no farmer could have fully prepared for, was that this particular failure would be filmed in high definition and shown to 40 million households as entertainment. The scene reads on screen as comedy. The presenter doesn't understand why his crop is dying. The farm manager explains patiently. There are expensive-looking yellow patches across an expensive-looking field. Laughter track absent but implied. The reality was, both men were standing in the direct aftermath of a regulatory decision made in Europe by scientists and commissioners, most of whom had never set foot on a British arable farm in a wet September. And the plant that died in that field, the crop that failed, was not just Clarkson's crop. It was a crop across England on thousands of farms, owned by farmers nobody was filming, whose losses were not entertainment, and whose financial consequences were very, very real. Here is the number that puts it in full perspective. In the 2012 growing season, before the ban, England's oilseed rape crop was worth approximately $1 billion to the farm gate. It was one of the most important break crops in the British arable rotation. It supported the soil. It gave farmers a second string. It held the rotation together. By 2021, that contribution had been reduced not just by price, but by area. The crop planted had halved. Farms that had grown oilseed rape for decades were growing spring barley instead, or leaving the slot in the rotation empty, or transitioning to completely different systems. The ban did not just affect the flea beetle, it rewrote the economics of a significant portion of British arable farming, quietly, over 8 years, with no television cameras watching. And the moment it became visible, the moment it appeared in full color on one of the most watched streaming platforms in the world, it was framed as a beginner's mistake by an unqualified television presenter. That framing was not just wrong. It was the precise opposite of the truth. Stand back, look at the full picture. A regulation passed in 2013 removed the only effective chemical control for cabbage stem flea beetle on oilseed rape. England's planted area of that crop fell from 756,000 hectares to under 390,000 over the following 8 years, a collapse of nearly 50% in one of the country's most important arable crops. Farmers who continued growing oilseed rape were forced to use broad-spectrum foliar sprays that were less effective against the target pest and more damaging to non-target insect populations, including the bees the regulation was designed to protect. The UK government, post-Brexit, recognized the inadequacy of the situation sufficiently to issue emergency authorisations for the banned chemical in 2021, 2022, and 2023, each time framing it as temporary. Each time quietly confirming that the original ban, in the specific conditions of British Northern European oilseed rape farming, had produced outcomes worse than the risk it was designed to prevent. Into that landscape, in 2019, walked Jeremy Clarkson. He planted oilseed rape. The flea beetles came. The pyrethroids failed. The crop was destroyed. 40 million people watched it happen and learned nothing about why. The farm wasn't unlucky. The farm was unprotected. And the law that left it unprotected was 6 years old before he planted his first seed. That is not a farming story. That is a policy story with a farming face. And the face that 40 million people remember, standing at the edge of a yellow, half-dead field, was not showing them incompetence. It was showing them the most expensive, most public, most watched consequence of a Brussels committee decision in British agricultural history. You just didn't know it yet. There is one genuinely unresolved question at the end of this story, and it deserves to be stated honestly. The science on neonicotinoids and bee health is not simple. The 2013 EFSA assessment was not invented or fabricated. There is real, peer-reviewed evidence that systemic insecticides can harm bee colonies under certain exposure conditions. The debate among scientists about the scale of that risk, relative to the risks posed by the alternatives, in the specific climatic and farming conditions of the UK, is ongoing, legitimate, and not close to settled. The emergency authorisations granted in 2021, 2022, and 2023 do not prove the original ban was wrong. They prove the practical situation is more complicated than the regulation anticipated. Those are different things. What is not in dispute is this: The gap between the regulation and its consequences was large enough and visible enough to have the planted area of one of Britain's most important crops over 8 years, and nobody connected that fact to the most watched farming documentary in streaming history. That gap between what policy intended and what farming experienced is exactly where the real story lives, and it is still not closed. If you watched Clarkson's farm and wondered why the flea beetles couldn't just be dealt with, now you know. And if you've ever grown oilseed rape, or farmed anywhere near Oxfordshire, or sat through a meeting where the words emergency authorization were used in a sentence, leave a comment below. We'd genuinely love to know whether you were one of the farmers living this story before it ever appeared on a screen. Subscribe if you haven't yet. There's a video on your screen right now about the next chapter of British farming policy that we think you'll want to see. Thank you as always for watching.